Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson, back with another thrilling installment of our discussion of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice with Jennifer Avery. It's been a hot second. How you doing, Jennifer?
Okay, man. How are you?
Pretty good. Pretty good. So, what terrain are we going to cover today?
The last time we finished the first volume of the book, and now we're starting on the second volume of the book. This is after Lizzie has turned down Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins has proposed to Charlotte Lucas, and Jane has gotten a letter from Miss Bingley saying that Mr. Bingley and all the family are in London for the season, and so that's pretty much where we left off, is just on a bunch of bad news for the Longbourn family. So,
all right. Well, we're off to the races. Why don't you take us through the beginning of the next volume?
Well, in the first chapter of the second volume, everything's still pretty miserable in the Longbourn house, but it gets even more so when Jane gets a letter from Caroline Bingley saying that they're all going to be settled in London for the whole season, and he's not going to be coming back for quite a while. And she actually hints that he might not come back at all and give up the lease on Netherfield. So poor little Jane is just absolutely dejected. And the way it starts here is hope was entirely over. And she doesn't really see anything that really gives her any comfort, and Miss Bingley, being the shrewish lady that she is, makes sure that most of the letter contains praise of Miss Darcy, who she wants to marry Mr. Bingley, and so Jane, of course, just takes it all at face value. But Lizzie, being a little bit more attuned to kind of the machinations of people like Caroline, she thinks that she doesn't give any credit to the idea that Miss Darcy, or that Mr. Bingley really wants to marry Miss Darcy. She thinks this is all Caroline Bingley trying to manipulate all of this. And of course we find out later who's right and who's wrong about that. But in any case, Lizzie is trying really hard to not think too badly of Mr. Bingley. But she can't help it, because she liked Mr. Bingley from the get-go, but it says that she could not think without anger, hardly without contempt, on that easiness of temper, that want of proper resolution, which now made him the slave of his designing friends, and led him to sacrifice his own happiness to the caprice of their inclinations. Had his own happiness, however, been the only sacrifice, he might have been allowed to sport with it in whatever manner he thought best, but her sister's was involved in it, as she thought he must be sensible himself. So she thinks that Mr. Bingley knows that Jane is suffering because of all of this, and her opinion of Mr. Bingley is now sunk because she feels like he's letting his friends manipulate him. And after reading the letter, Jane and Lizzie kind of get together and talk about it, about their opinions over it. And of course, Mrs. Bennet is, throughout all of this, Mrs. Bennet is just freaking out over Mr. Bingley not coming back, and she complains about it every day. And that really hurts Jane, and she finally admits to it to Lizzie. She's like, I really wish our mother had more command over herself. It's like the first time we really hear a negative from Jane about their mother. But she says that he'll be forgot, and that everybody will be as they were before. And Elizabeth doesn't quite believe her. let me see here. Okay, and then we get this nice little thing from Lizzie. This is a good example of Lizzie's character and her opinion of everything that's been going on here. Is that she feels like Jane has been really badly put upon in this way by both Mr. Bingley and his sisters, and she feels bad. And she also is kind of reeling over Charlotte marrying Mr. Collins because she can't believe that her smart, sensible, lovely friend would actually agree to marry this idiot. And so that's all of this kind of results in this little comment from Elizabeth to Jane. She said, "Nay, said Elizabeth, this is not fair. You wish to think all the world respectable, and are hurt if I speak ill of anybody. I only want to think you perfect, and you set yourself against it. Do not be afraid of my running into any excess, of my encroaching on your privilege of universal goodwill. You need not. There are few people whom I really love, and still fewer of whom I think well. The more I see of the world, the more I am dissatisfied with it. And every day confirms my belief of the inconsistency, of all human characters, and of the little dependence that can be placed on the appearance of either merit or sense. I have met with 2 instances lately. One I will not mention. The other is Charlotte's marriage. It is unaccountable. In every view, it is unaccountable." So this is Lizzie kind of experience a little bit of Weltsmirch, world weariness. And it's something that I can definitely relate to. She's basically saying the more she sees of the world, the more she realizes that the appearance of goodness is not really goodness. And she wants to, but Jane is like this perfect little creature who doesn't think badly of anybody, and who nobody could dare think badly of her. And so she's like, I just want to think of you as perfect. I can't think that of anybody else anymore. And that's kind of what she's saying here. And Jane just says, well, if you keep thinking like this, then you're just going to be unhappy for the rest of your life. And she also makes the argument for Charlotte marrying Mr. Collins. Just like, well, you don't think the same way that Charlotte does. The things that make you happy don't necessarily make her happy. And Charlotte's a simpler person as far as that's concerned. She just wants a nice, comfortable house. And her marriage to Mr. Collins is actually a really good idea if you look at it in this certain way. And Lizzie's still not really convinced, but she says she'll try to believe it, is what she says. But in any case, let me see, where is it? Okay, yeah. Okay, and, where is it? Okay. Okay, and she says, you shall not for the sake, this is Lizzie saying, Jane, you shall not for the sake of one individual change the meaning of principle and integrity, nor endeavor to persuade yourself or me that selfishness is prudence, and insensibility of danger security for happiness. And Jane says, I must think your language too strong in speaking of both, and I hope you will be convinced of it by seeing them happy together. And so Jane again is just like, well, I get what you're saying, but you're thinking of this too strongly. You're thinking too badly, more badly of them than they deserve. And so she kind of tries to convince Lizzie to kind of chill out on all of that. And then Jane says, well, you mentioned 2 instances, and she knows exactly what the other instance is, which is Mr. Bennet, or Mr. Bingley, rather. And she said, it is very often nothing but our own vanity that deceives us. Women fancy admiration means more than it does. So Jane blames herself for this. She blames herself for misunderstanding Mr. Bingley's attention for love, basically. And Jane does not want to think badly of Mr. Bingley. It'll make her even more miserable if she starts thinking badly of Mr. Bingley, and so she won't allow it. And that kind of chills Elizabeth out on it, and they don't talk about it anymore. But Jane does finally admit that it's pretty clear that they want Mr. Bingley to marry Miss Darcy. And let's see. And she says, this may be from better feelings than you are supposing. So maybe she feels like, well, if his family thinks he should marry Miss Darcy, then maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe they really do care about each other. And she continues by saying, do not distress me by the idea. I am not ashamed of having been mistaken, or at least it is slight. It is nothing in comparison of what I should feel in thinking ill of him or his sisters. Let me take it in the best light, in the light in which it may be understood. And so Jane refuses to think badly of anybody. And again, this is a good sketch of both of their characters. Lizzie's too smart. She sees all of this. She's more cynical. And Jane is more idealistic, and even though Jane knows that Lizzie may be right, maybe that she's even probably right, she admits that she wants to believe the best of people, and that's the way she's going to be until she's proven wrong. And so that's basically her. She feels like she would feel even worse if she thought badly of any of these people involved. So. And so Mrs. Bennet, and they decide after all of this that they're not going to talk about Mr. Bingley anymore, and they don't. But Mrs. Bennet made no promise, and she keeps on. And Mr. Bennet is basically like, well, so she's been crossed in love. Now it's your turn, Lizzie, to get crossed in love. Again, this is another illustration of his character. He says, so Lizzie, your sister is crossed in love, I find. I congratulate her. Next to being married, a girl likes to be crossed in love a little now and then. It is something to think of, and gives her a sort of distinction among her companions. When is your turn to come? You will hardly bear to be long outdone by Jane. Now is your time. Here are officers enough at Meryton to disappoint all the ladies young ladies in the country. Let Wickham be your man. He is a pleasant fellow, and would jilt you creditably. So he's just basically like, well, at least she's been crossed now, and she's got something to think about, and that's true. Really, it kind of is true, because back in those days, that's all that the women had to think about was their relationships with young men, and whether or not it ended up in marriage, and why it did or why it didn't. And that's and it does give a distinction, even to this day, when like a couple of girlfriends get together and talk about how one or the other of them was badly mistreated, then it does kind of give it does give sort of a distinction. It's like, oh, well, she got jilted, and bless her heart, and so, but that's basically what he's saying, is just like, well, now it's your turn, and you can't be long outdone. And he suggests Mr. Wickham would be a good person for her to, but in any case, but. Okay, and that leads to a little bit more about Mr. Wickham. It's like they still see Mr. Wickham really regularly, and we find out that everything that Mr. Wickham told Lizzie about Mr. Darcy and how he mistreated Mr. Wickham had become public knowledge. It had become because Lizzie shared the information with a few of her friends. Mr. Wickham feels like, oh, well, everybody else is going to believe me now too, and so he lets the story out. Mr. Darcy's not there anymore, and so Mr. Wickham lets the story kind of become public knowledge. Now, to a cynical modern mind, you would immediately think, wait a minute, why didn't he say anything about this while Mr. Darcy was still in town? So he doesn't let it go. He doesn't let it be known to anybody else until Mr. Darcy's gone. So that should be a red flag. But it's not to anybody, because everybody in that area already doesn't like Mr. Darcy, so they believe it. So there's that going on too. And again, Jane is the only person who's not convinced of it. And again, we see the two instances where Lizzie is right about the Mr. Bingley situation, which we find out later, and Jane is right about the Mr. Wickham or the Mr. Darcy situation, which we find out later. And so you can see where Prejudice is working against Lizzie and Jane at this point. In any case, but Jane pretty much says, well, everything could be a mistake. So I'm not going to totally believe all this in Mr. Darcy, because there could be some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. And that's where we leave off on chapter 1. So in chapter 2, we get into, Mr. Collins is left because he had come back after his engagement to Charlotte. Now he's gone again, and the next Monday after Mr. Collins is gone, Mr. and Mrs. Gardner come into town. Now Mr. Gardner is Mrs. Bennet's brother, and Mr. Gardner is much more intelligent and more well-mannered than his sister, and so is Mrs. Gardner. And there are some scholars that say that Mrs. Gardner is the wisest character in this book, and I tend to agree with it, because Mrs. Gardner is a wonderful character, and she only pops up a few times, but she is the smartest of any of these people. And so But the Gardners come into town to spend Christmas with everyone at Longbourn with their family, and everybody really and all the sisters really like the Gardners, and they always look forward to them visiting, and it says that between the two eldest and herself, especially, there subsisted a very particular regard. So Mrs. Gardner is particularly close to Lizzie and Jane. And again, and obviously because Lizzie and Jane are the two most sensible of the sisters, and so they would of course have their aunt's influence there. But in any case, so they come into town and they talk about everything that's been going on, and Mrs. Bennet whines and complains about everything, about how she's been ill-used, and she's mad at Lizzie still for refusing Mr. Collins, and she's mad at Mr. Bingley, and she's so nervous and stressed out, and boo-hoo-hoo. And after that, though, Jane, Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardner have a few minutes to talk to each other about the whole situation with Jane. And this is a great little exchange that I really like between Mrs. Gardner and Lizzie. Lizzie says to Mrs. Gardner, an excellent, we do not suffer by accident, Lizzie says. It does not often happen that the interference of friends will persuade a young man of independent fortune to think no more of a girl whom he was violently in love with only a few days before. But that expression of violently in love is so hackneyed, so doubtful, so indefinite, that it gives me very little idea. And this is Mrs. Gardner. It is as often applied to feelings which arise only from a half-hour's acquaintance as to a real strong attachment. Pray, how violent was Mr. Bingley's love? Well, you see her sense right here, because this is something that happens to this very day. Words get applied too liberally. Strong words get applied too liberally to situations that aren't that strong. Mrs. Gardner argues that how could he have been violently in love? What do you mean by violently in love? Because people say violently in love about somebody who just saw somebody across the room. And it doesn't really mean anything. And that's basically what Mrs. Gardner is saying. And Lizzie says, I never saw a more promising inclination. He was growing quite inattentive to other people and wholly engrossed by her. Every time they met, it was more decided and remarkable. At his own ball, he offended 2 or 3 young ladies by not asking them to dance. And I spoke to him twice myself without receiving an answer. Could there be finer symptoms? Is not general incivility the very essence of love? So Lizzie says, well, if he's not paying attention to anybody else, he's being uncivil to everybody else except Jane, so obviously he was in love with her. And Mrs. Gardner says, oh yes, of that kind of love which I suppose him to have felt. Poor Jane, I am sorry for her, because with her disposition she may not get over it immediately. It had better have happened to you, Lizzie. You would have laughed yourself out of it sooner. But do you think she would be prevailed on to go back with us? Change of scene might be of service, and perhaps a little relief from home may be as useful as anything. And again, we see Mrs. Gardner's wisdom here. She's like, she's like, well, yeah, general incivility is a symptom of the kind of love that he probably felt for her, which was probably not that deep. And she makes this nice little observation is that Lizzie would have just laughed her way out of it, but Jane's a little bit more sensitive, and so it's going to hurt her for longer. And then she says, well, why doesn't she come back to London with us so she can get away from Mrs. Bennet and all this mess and kind of forget about it? And Lizzie thinks that's a grand idea. So we go on. So they. Let me see here. And they discuss whether or not Mr. Bingley might show up and visit Jane, but they decide, well, it'd be best if he didn't, and he probably wouldn't show up anyway. But Caroline will probably come and call. But we probably won't see Mr. Bingley, and both Lizzie and Mrs. Gardner think that would probably be good. But in any case, so they spend a week at the Gardners stay at Longbourn for a week, and Mrs. Bennet feels like and whenever she has guests, she wants to make sure that they have something to do every night. And so for the whole week, they're visiting, or somebody's visiting them, or they're going off someplace. They're always doing something, and Mr. Wickham is often there, and Mrs. Gardner keeps a close eye on Mr. Wickham, because she says, rendered suspicious by Elizabeth's warm commendation of him, narrowly observed them both. So Mrs. Gardner's watching, because she can tell Lizzie kind of likes him. But she decides that they're don't really seem to be really serious about each other, and so she, but it makes her a little bit uneasy, because there's obviously, they obviously kind of like each other, but he doesn't have he's not a good match. He doesn't have the money, and he doesn't have the connections and all that stuff that mattered in marriages back then. But we do find out that Mrs. Gardner and Wickham have something in common, in that they spent a lot of time in Derbyshire, which is where Mr. Darcy's estate is, at Pemberley, and they grew up near, and they both spent time near Pemberley, and so they have this thing in common that they talk about, and Mrs. Gardner, on learning this, kind of tries to remember some things about the Darcys, and she remembers hearing something about how Mr. Darcy was an ill-natured boy, and so she's she doesn't really think about it anymore. And that's the end of chapter 2. So chapter 3. Let's see here. Okay, chapter 3, again, Mrs. Gardner's still there, and again she takes Lizzie aside, and she had decided to talk to her about the whole Wickham thing. And so they go and talk about Mr. Wickham and as she basically says, Lizzie, you be careful with this fella. Don't encourage him. Don't let him think that you might actually want to be with him, because he doesn't have a lot of money. He's not a good match, and there's something about him I don't quite like, and that sort of thing. And Lizzie says, and Lizzie kind of reassures Mrs. Gardner, I see the imprudence of it. Oh, that abominable Mr. Darcy. My father's opinion of me does me the greatest honor, and I should be miserable to forfeit it. My father, however, is partial to Mr. Wickham. In short, my dear aunt, I should be very sorry to be the means of making any of you unhappy. But since we see every day that where there is affection, young people are seldom withheld, by immediate want of fortune, from entering into engagements with each other, how can I promise to be wiser than so many of my fellow creatures, if I am tempted? Or how am I even to know that it would be wisdom to resist? So basically she's like, well, people hook up who aren't matched well. People who aren't matched well hook up all the time. How can I promise to be smarter than everybody else? And see, all that I can promise you, therefore, is not to be in a hurry. I will not be in a hurry to believe myself his first object. When I am in company with him, I will not be wishing. In short, I will do my best. And so basically, Lizzie says, well, I won't be in a hurry, okay? But she does admit that she's not really in love with Wickham at this point. And the aunt and Mrs. Gardner's kind of feels better about it. And Lizzie says, I hope you are satisfied. And her aunt assured her that she was, and Elizabeth, having thanked her for the kindness of her hints, they parted. A wonderful instance of advice being given on such a point without being resented. That's a rare thing. That's a rare thing to this very day with any human being. A lot of times when you give advice to somebody, even if it's in their best interest, and even if they know that, they just get ill at you. But Lizzie doesn't get mad at Mrs. Gardner, which is again another hint that Lizzie is actually wiser than most of her fellow creatures. Anyway, Mr. Collins comes back into town, and before long, he and Charlotte are married, and Charlotte takes Lizzie aside and says, well, my father and my sister are going to come and visit me in Kent in a few months. Why don't you come with them? And Lizzie kind of isn't really excited about it, but she's like, okay, but she agrees to it anyway. But in any case, they have their wedding, and Elizabeth and Charlotte kind of correspond with each other not long afterwards. And Charlotte sounds very happy. She sounds content with everything, and Lizzie's just kind of, she says, Elizabeth soon heard from her friend, and their correspondence was as regular and frequent as it had ever been. That it should be equally unreserved was impossible. Elizabeth could never address her without feeling that all the comfort of intimacy was over, and though determined not to slacken as a correspondent, it was for the sake of what had been rather than what was. So Lizzie's still not really happy about Charlotte marrying Mr. Collins, because she just doesn't think that Charlotte's going to be happy. She doesn't understand how Charlotte could be happy. A smart, intelligent girl like Charlotte could be happy with an idiot like Mr. Collins. And so she feels that she's lost something in their relationship. And so she feels like when they're communicating with each other, she feels like she can't really be as open with Charlotte as she used to be. And that happens a lot, again, to this day, is when, when somebody gets married and you don't like the person they're married to, then you don't talk to them that much anymore. And that's pretty much what's happening here with Charlotte and Lizzie. But Lizzie does agree to go and visit with her. But Charlotte seems happy enough. And Jane had gone back with the Gardners to London, and so Jane's been in London for a little while. And she starts sending letters too. And so she tells Lizzie that Mrs. Gardner had gone into the Bingleys area of town. Now, the Gardners live in Gracechurch Street, which is in Cheapside, which is a part of London that was not like the Hood or anything, but it was industrial. There were a lot of plants, there was a lot of industry in that area of town. And because of that, it was seen as being extremely unfashionable. Like, the people who lived there weren't necessarily poor or obscure or anything. They were mainly tradespeople, like Mr. Gardner. And so the Bingleys would look down their noses at anybody who lives in this part of London because it's unfashionable. But the Bingleys, or the Bingley sisters, are staying in a much more fashionable part of town. And a lot of times when you had friends in town in London, while you were in London, it was polite and expected that if you came near that neighborhood, that you would call on the person that you know and visit with them and come and talk to them. And so Mrs. Gardner goes into the area of London where the Bingleys live. And Jane comes with her and pays a visit to Caroline. And everything seems okay. But it takes Caroline over a month to repay the visit, which would have been extremely rude. It would have been obvious that she didn't want to see her. But she eventually pays the visit, and Lizzie gets a letter about it. So basically Jane writes to Lizzie that I confess to have been entirely deceived in Miss Bingley's regard for me. But, my dear sister, though the event has proved you right, do not think me obstinate if I still assert that, considering what her behavior was, my confidence was as natural as your suspicion. And so basically, she tells the story about how Caroline Bingley comes to see her. And it was obvious that she didn't want to be there. And she didn't spend much time with her. She doesn't talk to her much. She doesn't wish her in. She doesn't say to Jane, I'd like to come and see. I'd like to see you again. And she basically it's just like a formal obligatory visit that she makes, and she makes it very obvious that that's what it is. And so Jane decides that she should completely give up knowing her. She says when she did come, it was very evident that she had no pleasure in it. She made a slight formal apology for not calling before, said not a word of wishing to see me again, and was in every respect so altered a creature that when she went away I was perfectly resolved to continue the acquaintance no longer. But still, Jane, being the sweet little thing that she is I pity her. Because she must feel that she has been acting wrong, and because I am very sure that anxiety for her brother is the cause of it. So she still is defending this lady after she has been so rude to her. This is just the way Jane is. But she's amazed that Miss Bingley would be this way because she was the one who wanted to be friendly with Jane. She was the one who always started conversations, who always approached her, who invited her to dinner, and all of these things, and now she just doesn't care. And so it becomes obvious that the only reason Miss Bingley wanted to have any company with Jane was just so she would have some company. And that was it. It had nothing to do with Jane, and it was just, well, I'd like to see somebody beside my sister and my brother-in-law and my brother. is all it was. And so, of course, Elizabeth is just amazed by this, or she's not amazed, but she's not surprised at all, actually. But it makes her mad, and it makes her feel so bad for Jane. But she feels better because now Jane knows what's up, just like Elizabeth did from the beginning. And then she gets a letter, and then she gets a letter from Mrs. Gardner, and she returns a letter to Mrs. Gardner. And we find out through this that Mr. Wickham no longer pays any attention to Elizabeth. Mr. Wickham has started paying more attention to another young lady, and this other young lady is interesting because she has just gotten £10,000 after the death of an uncle. So now Mr. Wickham is going after this lady because of the money. But Lizzie is not annoyed by this. She doesn't even seem to care very much because she feels like it's practical. But she doesn't make the same allowances for Charlotte about her practical reasons for marrying Mr. Collins, the same way she's forgiving Mr. Wickham for his practical reasons for going after this girl. And again, this is another example of the prejudice part of Pride and Prejudice, is that she's biased because she likes Mr. Wickham. And even though she likes Charlotte too, but she so dislikes Mr. Collins that she can't account for it. She can't make peace with it in her head. But in any case, and she tells Mrs. Gardner about all of this, and in her letter she says to Mrs. Gardner, "I am now convinced, my dear aunt, that I have never been much in love. For had I really experienced that pure and elevating passion, I should at present detest his very name, and wish him all manner of evil. But my feelings are not only cordial towards him, they are even impartial towards Miss King. I cannot find out that I hate her at all, or that I am in the least unwilling to think her a very good sort of girl. There can be no love in all this. My watchfulness has been effectual. And though I should certainly be a more interesting object to all my acquaintance were I distractedly in love with him, I cannot say that I regret my comparative insignificance. Importance may sometimes be purchased too dearly." Good point. "Kitty and Lydia take this defection much more to heart than I do. They are young in the ways of the world, and not yet open to the mortifying conviction that handsome young men must have something to live on, as well as the plain." Now, this is one of the most famous lines in this novel, is handsome young men must have something to live on, as well as the plain. And that is sort of a wry way of looking at relationships at this time in history in England, is that nothing matters except the money and the name. Unless this guy is just obvious, like a criminal, as he's been disgraced in some way, or what have you, he is still an eligible match if he has money or if he has a name. And that's all that matters. And that is her way of kind of poking fun at that. Handsome young men must have something to live on, as well as the plain. So none of that mattered in marriage at this point in time, for the most part. At least not on a social level. So there's that. And that's the end of chapter 3. Alright. And chapter 4. Chapter 4 is when, basically, January and February pass, and nothing happens at all. And so she skips on, and we talk about going to Kent, Hunsford, to see Charlotte and Mr. Collins. And Lizzie says that at first she she actually didn't really plan on going. At first she was like, well, I told her I would, but I don't know if I really want to. I mean, I'd have to pack and travel and all this stuff. But as time goes on and things get really, really boring, get long boring, she starts to think more positively about it. There was a novelty in the scheme. And as with such a mother and such uncompanionable sisters, home could not be faultless. A little change was not unwelcome for its own sake. The journey would, moreover, give her a peep at Jane, and in short, as the time drew near, she would have been very sorry for any delay. Everything, however, went on smoothly, and was finally settled according to Charlotte's first sketch. She was to accompany Sir William and his second daughter. The improvement of spending a night in London was added in time, and the plan became perfect as plan could be. The only pain was in leaving her father, who would certainly miss her, and who, when it came to the point, so little liked her going, that he told her to write to him and almost promised to answer her letter. So she starts to look forward to it because her mom gets on her nerves. The only sister that she really gets along with well is already out away from home, and there's nothing really going on. And so she's like, it'll be good just to have a little bit of a change of pace. And as often happened when ladies took these trips, is they would stop in London, stop with somebody that they knew, and so they decide to stop at the gardener's so she can see Jane, and then they'll go on to Kent. And of course her father, who as we've talked about before, is kind of a sardonic, intelligent guy, is going to be surrounded by the dumbest of his family, and he will have nobody to really talk to. And so, of course, he's going to miss Lizzie a lot. So they go on to London, and we get a little look at Sir William Lucas and Maria. She says Maria's a good-humored girl, but as empty-headed as Sir William. Had nothing to say that could be worth hearing, and were listened to with about as much delight as the rattle of the chase. Elizabeth loved absurdities, but she had known Sir William's too long. He could tell her nothing new of the wonders of his presentation in knighthood, and his civilities were worn out like his information. And so, Lizzie's not real, she's just kind of like, I'm here, I'm not even going to pay attention to these people. But they get to London, and again she sees Jane, and again she talks to Mrs. Gardiner, kind of one-on-one, after they're at a play, and they're sitting next to each other, and they take a minute to kind of chat a little bit out of Jane's hearing, and they talk about Wickham too. And here's the conversation about Wickham. Lizzie says about Miss King, who is the woman who's Wickham's intended now. She is a very good kind of girl, I believe. I know no harm of her. And Mrs. Gardiner says, but he paid her not the smallest attention till her grandfather's death made her mistress of this fortune. No, why should he? If it were not allowable for him to gain my affections because I had no money, what occasion could there be for making love to a girl whom he did not care about and who was equally poor? But there seems indelicacy in directing his attentions towards her so soon after this event. A man in distressed circumstances has not time for all those elegant decorums which other people may observe. If she does not object to it, why should we? Her not objecting does not justify him. It only shows her being deficient in something herself, sense or feeling. Well, cried Elizabeth, have it as you choose. He shall be a mercenary, and she shall be foolish. No, Lizzie, that is what I do not choose. I should be sorry, you know, to think ill of a young man who has lived so long in Derbyshire. So, in this conversation, again, we see Lizzie being a little bit blind to all this, and Mrs. Gardner seeing it. So even though it's accepted that men go after women who can give them money, or whose parents can give them money, or who have a fortune or something to inherit, there still should be some sort of time limit between her getting it and him going after her. And so Mrs. Gardner kind of sees something fishy in him suddenly paying attention to this girl right after her grandfather died and gave her all this money. And Lizzie's like, well, I mean, Mr. Wickham's really poor, so who can blame the guy? But Mrs. Gardner's like, this doesn't really make sense to me, even though Miss King doesn't seem to mind this. It is evidence that Miss King herself is kind of dumb. You know, if she's accepting this attention so soon after this and not really caring that it seems to be only because she now has all this money, then she is dumb. And again, this is proof of Mrs. Gardner's sense. She is the smartest of all of the people in this book. More proof of that here. Let me see here. Okay, and but at the same time, Mrs. Gardner's like, she doesn't want to think ill of anybody who's from Derbyshire because she really liked Derbyshire. And Lizzie says, oh, if that is all, I have a very poor opinion of young men who live in Derbyshire, which means Mr. Darcy. And their intimate friends who live in Hertfordshire are not much better, which means Mr. Bingley. I am sick of them all. Thank heaven, I am going tomorrow where I shall find a man who has not one agreeable quality, who has neither manner nor sense to recommend him. Stupid men are the only ones worth knowing after all. You know, I feel this way sometimes too. I really do. And Mrs. Gardner says, take care, Lizzie. That speech savors strongly of disappointment. Which, yeah, it kind of does. And that's what happens to modern women when they hit 40 and, yeah. But in any case, after all this, after that little speech there, Mrs. Gardner kind of tells Lizzie, well, hey, me and Mr. Gardner are going to go on or basically we're going to go on a vacation this summer, where we're going to tour the Lake District, which is a really, really beautiful part of England that tourists often went to, just, you know, as like a mini vacation, like the same way that we today would go to the Grand Canyon or to like the Smokies or something like that. That's what they're going to do this summer, and they invite Lizzie to come along. And Lizzie says, what delight, what felicity, you give me fresh life and vigor. Adieu to disappointment and spleen. What are men to rocks and mountains? Oh, what hours of transport shall we spend? And Lizzie's really excited about this. It's like, oh, I can get away from all of this mess again this summer. So in any case, that's the end of chapter 4. Which brings us to chapter 5. And in chapter 5, Elizabeth and company show up at Hunsford. And this is where Mr. Collins and Charlotte live now. And, let me see here. Okay, and they go in, so they come into the parsonage, and immediately Mr. Collins, you know, shows everything off to her and to everybody in the family. She says, okay, here we go. Elizabeth was prepared to see him in his glory, and she could not help fancying that in displaying the good proportion of the room, its aspect, and its furniture, he addressed himself particularly to her. as if wishing to make her feel what she had lost in refusing him. But though everything seemed neat and comfortable, she was not able to gratify him by any sigh of repentance, and rather looked with wonder at her friend that she could have so cheerful an air in such a companion. So she feels like Mr. Collins is showing all this off, particularly to her. It's like, hey, you could have had all this. And but Lizzie just doesn't care. She's like, this doesn't matter to me. As a matter of fact, I have no idea what Charlotte's thinking because you're driving me nuts, and I don't see how she's putting up with you right now. So they go through the house, and Mr. Collins shows everything off, and then he and Sir William decide to go into the garden, and the ladies stay in the house. And Mr. Collins talks about his garden. And we get this little bit here. To work in his garden was one of his most respectable pleasures. And Elizabeth admired the command of countenance with which Charlotte talked of the healthfulness of the exercise, and owned she encouraged it as much as possible. So basically Charlotte says, I encourage him to be out in his garden, because that means he is not in here bugging me. So Elizabeth is kind of satisfied to see that Charlotte knows that he is an idiot, but she's making the most of her situation. By, she's encouraging him to go out, to leave the house so she can have it to herself for a little while, which is probably what I would do in the same situation. But, and so in any case, they decide to go, so the ladies decide to go back in the house, and Charlotte seems really happy to have the house to herself to show off to the girls without Mr. Collins coming in and talking through his butt the whole time. And they find out a little bit more about Lady Catherine. And Lady Catherine is in town, is in the area still, and Mr. Collins, they've already come back in, and Mr. Collins kind of goes on and on about how he and Charlotte are invited to Rosings to dine twice a week. You'll be able to see all of this condescension and glory because you'll most certainly be invited to dine with her at some point. Or you'll be invited to tea, he thinks. Charlotte says Lady Catherine is a very respectable, sensible woman indeed, and a most attentive neighbor. And so they talk for most of the evening about what's been going on and where Lizzie's from in Hertfordshire. And let me see here. Okay, and after all of this conversation about Rosings and then about Hertfordshire, Lizzie goes up into her room to be by herself to kind of think about everything. And she says, Elizabeth in the solitude of her chamber had to meditate upon Charlotte's degree of contentment, to understand her address in guiding and composure in bearing with her husband, and to acknowledge that it was all done very well. She had also to anticipate how her visit would pass, the quiet tenor of their usual employments, the vexatious interruptions of Mr. Collins, and the gaieties of their intercourse with Rosings. A lively imagination soon settled it all. And so she has to admit that Charlotte's taking care of business pretty well. Mr. Collins is an idiot, and it doesn't really make sense that she would be with him, but Charlotte is doing her best, and that's all she can do at this point. And so Lizzie kind of admires that. And the next morning, everybody, the house just goes crazy. Like, everybody in the house is running around, something's going on, and here comes Mariah Lucas, and she says, "Oh, Lizzie, you got to come down here and see this." And Lizzie's expecting something like crazy's going on in the garden or something, but all it is Lady Catherine's daughter, Miss Anderberg. And Lizzie has this little all that Lizzie thinks about Miss de Bourgh is, "I like her appearance," said Elizabeth, struck with other ideas. "She looks sickly and cross. Yes, she will do for him very well. She will make him a very proper wife, and he, of course, is Mr. Darcy." All she sees is something is like, yep, he can run right over this girl. It'll be perfect. So that's all that she sees in Miss Anne de Bourgh. And then they find out, and Miss de Bourgh, while she's there, she invites them to come and have dinner at Rosings with Lady Catherine. Now, Mr. Collins expected like tea or something, but they're being invited to dinner. And so Mr. Collins is like, "Oh, well, you are being greatly honored. She's inviting you to dinner, and all this." And that's all that they talk about for the whole day. And that's the end of chapter 5, and on to chapter 6 is when we get to meet Lady Catherine. And Mr. Collins is all very proud of himself for all of this happening. Let me see here. And Lady Catherine, let me see. Okay, and the whole morning before the dinner, that's all they're talking about is going to Rosings for dinner. And when the ladies leave to go get ready, basically, Mr. Collins tells Lizzie, "Do not make yourself uneasy, my dear cousin, about your apparel. Lady Catherine is far from requiring that elegance of dress in us which becomes herself and daughter. I would advise you merely to put on whatever of your clothes is superior to the rest. There is no occasion for anything more. Lady Catherine will not think the worse of you for being simply dressed. She likes to have the distinction of rank preserved." And so he says, "Don't worry about how you dress. Lady Catherine likes to know that you know your place," is basically what he's saying. And Lady Catherine likes to know that she is better than everybody she's with. Is the basic what that basically means to me, and probably to Lizzie too. So they get ready, and then they finally go to Lady Catherine's house, to Rosings Park. And Maria and Sir William were all in raptures, completely, amazed by everything that they see. And Lizzie, Elizabeth's courage did not fail her. She had heard nothing of Lady Catherine that spoke her awful from any extraordinary talents or miraculous virtue, and the mere stateliness of money and rank she thought she could witness without trepidation. And so Mr. Collins, the whole time that they're walking through and up to, he's talking about how much the glazing on the windows cost, how awesome the entry hall is. He's just bragging on everything about Rosings. And let me see here. Okay, and when they finally meet Lady Catherine, Charlotte's the one who introduces them, and she had made sure of that. And she says, "Her ladyship with great condescension arose to receive them, and as Mrs. Collins had settled it with her husband that the office of introduction should be hers, it was performed in a proper manner, without any of those apologies and thanks which he would have thought necessary." So they've met Lady Catherine now, and Sir William is kind of tongue-tied and seems nervous, and Maria can't really say anything or do anything because she's just so scared of saying anything. And Lizzie's just like, whatever. Elizabeth found herself quite equal to the scene, and could observe the three ladies before her composedly. Lady Catherine was a tall, large woman, with strongly marked features which might once have been handsome. Her air was not conciliating, nor was her manner of receiving them such as to make her visitors forget their inferior rank. She was not rendered formidable by silence, but whatever she said was spoken in so authoritative a tone as marked her self-importance, and brought Mr. Wickham immediately to Elizabeth's mind. And from the observation of the day altogether, she believed Lady Catherine to be exactly what he had represented. So Lizzie is pretty much, she's seeing what she expected in Lady Catherine, that she's way too fond of her rank, and she likes to lord over people and command people, and that's pretty much what she sees. And Mr. Berg was pale and sickly, and Mrs. Jenkinson is basically Lady Catherine's daughter's caretaker, and all she does is look after Mr. Berg, and she doesn't say anything to anybody else. So then they go, so after they kind of spend a little bit of time, they go into dinner, and and Sir William and Mr. Collins, all they do is praise and delight over everything that's put in front of them on the dinner table. And Elizabeth makes this observation, and every dish was commended first by him and then by Sir William, who was now enough recovered to echo whatever his son-in-law said, in a manner which Elizabeth wondered Lady Catherine could bear. But Lady Catherine seemed gratified by their excessive admiration, and gave most gracious smiles, especially when any dish on the table proved a novelty to them. So Elizabeth would have been annoyed by all of this, basically butt licking that's going on, and she can't imagine how Lady Catherine is putting up with it. But Lady Catherine seems completely gratified by it. She likes it. She likes having sycophants around. She likes having those noses right up the butt, and that is a really, and that's a really telling thing about this character, is that she likes to be important. She likes to be the most important person in the room, in the family, in the world.
Well, hold on one second. Are you enjoying the fact that you're going to make me go in and put censoring edits into this later?
You have to censor that? I'm sorry.
I don't know. I think you were checking to see if I was listening.
Well,
I was trying to exercise some self-control so you get as far as you can through the volume. I didn't know it was going to turn into a sailor session.
Well, you know, I could have used other wording that would have been worse. So.
No, you're good. You're good. I'll have to find like a goose that goes "Awooga" or something like that.
Sorry.
Proceed.
I apologize. But that's what it is. Hey, we got to be straight.
Yeah, you got to keep it real. Keep it real.
So anyway, they have dinner. All this going on, and then the ladies go to the drawing room, and again, all Lady Catherine does is talk. And she makes suggestions and tells people. Basically, she tells everybody how to do everything. Is the way she presents herself, and after a while, she kind of sets her sights on Elizabeth. And she starts asking Lizzie questions. She asked her about, she basically asked her about everything. She asked her at different times how many sisters she had, whether they were older or younger than herself, whether any of them were likely to be married, whether they were handsome, where they had been educated, what carriage her father kept, and what had been her mother's maiden name. Elizabeth felt all the impertinence of her questions, but answered them very composedly. So Lady Catherine is basically being extremely nosy. Like, she's asking about what kind of carriage her father has. And it's obvious that she's asking these questions to kind of determine how important Lizzie's family is. And and she starts to ask more questions about Lizzie's education, and Lizzie tells her that they didn't have a governess, and of course Lady Catherine is appalled by this. She can't believe it. You have 5 daughters brought up at home with no governess, and she asks questions about who taught them, and all of that, and Lizzie, who is not at all scared by Lady Catherine and all of her questions, just answers honestly. She answers everything honestly. When Lady Catherine asks her, then who taught you? Who attended to you? Without a governess, you must have been neglected. Compared with some families, I believe we were. But such of us as wished to learn never wanted the means. We were always encouraged to read, and had all the masters that were necessary. Those who chose to be idle certainly might. I no doubt, but that is what a governess will prevent. And if I had known your mother, I should have advised her most strenuously to engage one. And then she goes on about how many people she's gotten governesses for and how happy they were about it. And she goes on about this for a while, and then she turns her attention back to Lizzie. She asks her if her younger sisters are out. And what that means, and we may have talked about this before, but I'm not sure, but when you, in any of these Regency or Victorian era novels, you see, if they ask if a lady is out, what they mean is, are they out in society? Are they able to be out in society? Can they go to balls? Things like that. Because usually what happened was that if you had more than one girl in a family, the eldest girl would come out at 16, 15, 16 years old, maybe younger, and that means and usually there would be a ball, like an official ball to officially say she's out into society, and all of that, and she would be the only one out until she got married. And then the next oldest daughter would come out. It's basically to not have competition between sisters, essentially, is what that's for. But in any case, Lizzie tells Lady Catherine that all of them are out. And Lady Catherine is amazed to hear this. And she says, the younger one's out before the elder are married. Your younger sisters must be very young. Yes, my youngest is not 16. Perhaps she is full young to be much in company. But really, ma'am, I think it would be very hard upon younger sisters that they should not have their share of society and amusement, because the elder may not have the means or inclination to marry early. The last born has as good a right to the pleasures of youth as the first. And to be kept back on such a motive, I think it would not be very likely to promote sisterly affection or delicacy of mind. And so Lizzie is basically saying, kind of defending this idea of all 5 of them being out, which is not Lady Catherine's opinion. And so Lady Catherine says, upon my word, you give your opinion very decidedly for so young a person. So Lady Catherine is not used to anybody making a point opposite to hers. And the minute somebody does, she sees impertinence or there's something wrong. That's a good illustration of her character. It's like she is the only one who is right. You do not question me because I am more important than you, and my opinion is the only one that matters. That's Lady Catherine. Lady Catherine seemed quite astonished at not receiving a direct answer, and Elizabeth suspected herself to be the first creature who had ever dared to trifle with so much dignified impertinence. So after that, after all of that, the men come in after dinner, and they all play cards. And basically, all that happens here is that you see Lady Catherine basically directing everybody and getting on to everybody for playing the wrong plays or putting out the wrong cards. And at Lizzie's table, she's with Miss de Bourgh and Mrs. Jenkinson, and all that happens there is Mrs. Jenkinson basically just makes sure that Miss de Bourgh isn't too hot or too cold, or or it's not too light or too dark for her, and all that. And that's pretty much okay. Okay, so after they get done playing cards, the party then gathered around the fire to hear Lady Catherine determine what weather they were to have on the morrow. From these instructions, they were summoned by the arrival of the coach, and with many speeches of thankfulness on Mr. Collins' side, and as many bows on Sir William's, they departed. As soon as they had driven from the door, Elizabeth was called on by her cousin to give her opinion of all that she had seen at Rosings, which for Charlotte's sake she made more favourable than it really was. But her commendation, though costing her some trouble, could by no means satisfy Mr. Collins, and he was very soon obliged to take her ladyship's praise into his own hands. And so this whole, and that's the end of chapter 6. This whole experience with Lady Catherine is exactly what Elizabeth expected. And that's not a good thing. Because she could, as just given what as she had said earlier on when Mr. Collins first shows up, just given the way that Mr. Collins talks about her, she sounds like this ostentatious, disagreeable, uppity lady, and that's exactly what she is. And again, this is another illustration of how good Lizzie is at figuring out somebody's character. And even though she struggles with some people, Lady Catherine, she pretty much had nailed just from descriptions from Mr. Collins and Mr. Wickham. And that's exactly what she is. Lady Catherine is, nobody's right except her. Nobody's more important than she is. And if you don't pay attention to what she says, if you don't do what she says, then there's something wrong with you. And that's basically how she is. And but despite this, Mr. Collins is so dumb that he doesn't see it that way. He just compliments, and he's a sycophant. He's completely a sycophant, and he is so dumb that he's blinded to all of this, that how she controls his life. And Lizzie sees that, and so she's just like, well, at least I'm seeing Charlotte. So that's pretty much the end of that. And just like I said, just through this whole section is basically a setup. Austen is setting up what's coming next, which is people that Lizzie knows are coming to Rosings, and there's going to be some stuff going on here. But that's why I stopped there, because there's going to be a lot coming in that. But like I said, that section is just set up, exposition, what we call exposition in the literary world. So the real stuff starts next week or next time. So.
Well, that was a fantastic session. I liked how wound up you were for that. That was good. And I think it's good for me to pull back a little bit and just kind of let you do your thing. I wanted to let you know, I wanted to compliment you on air. I know you've been sharing some of your writing in public lately, and I want to say I am very, very impressed with your creative writing. Yeah. We didn't mention this at the beginning, but Jennifer is also an editor if anyone would like to work with her. What's your email again?
My email is javerysce@gmail.com if you want me to edit your manuscript. And I'm a very meticulous editor. If you need a meticulous editor, then send me an email. Or if you'd like some tutoring on creative writing or literature or grammar, then I'm also happy to do that. And again, that's javerysce@gmail.com.
When are you going to share your writing with the world?
Well, I gotta finish. I have a friend who is starting a press soon, and he wants me to put out 150 pages of poetry. And whenever that happens, then that's probably going to be the first thing that comes out. And I have to first write more poems because I don't think I have that many.
Well,
but
I want to encourage you to keep doing the recitations of your work and to do readings of them and things like that. Maybe we can find a home for them somehow on Noetic too.
I'd be happy. Yeah, I've had some poems published in the Blue Mountain Review, Ishan Literary Review, and what is it? I forgot the name of it. It's the journal associated with Backlash Press in the UK.
Yeah, but and that's all fine and good. It is good, but there's something about you reading your own work that is really magical. I'm not going to downplay that, but the combination of your words and your voice, it was just pure music to me.
I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. And yeah, if anybody wants to see it, then it's on my Facebook page, Jennifer Avery. Just look me up on Facebook, and it's there somewhere. And it's also on YouTube, the Southern Collective Experience YouTube channel. So
good. I'm glad you got a plug in for that. It really is a special experience, and I highly recommend it for everybody.
Well, thank you.
All right, download the. Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer. Download the Noetic app. I will edit all the audio. Part of the reason I didn't want to chime in is to make my audio editing so easy. But then you had to go curse up a blue streak.
Oh yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. Maybe, yeah. I'll figure out something. I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm sure it'll be fine. No problem. All right. Well, I'll talk to you soon, Jennifer. Thank you so much.